Hello, and welcome to the 6Ds, How to Turn Training and Development into Business Results. I'm Andy Jefferson, and I am the CEO of the 6Ds company.
And I'm Roy Pollack. I'm the Chief Learning Officer.
We are the co-authors of The 6 Disciplines of Breakthrough Learning and the Field Guide of the 6 Disciplines.
In this video, we'll introduce you to the 6 disciplines that will enable you to create greater value and therefore competitive advantage for yourself and your company by ensuring that investments in company-sponsored training and development produce business results and are not just feel-good events.
That's important because learning has never been more important than it is today. The late Jack Welch famously observed that an organization's ability to learn and then to translate that learning into real action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage.
Why is learning more important than ever? Because the business world is changing and the pace of that change is accelerating. That means that even if you're the leader in your field today, if you're standing still while your competitors are learning and improving, then before long, they'll catch up with you and pass you by. Nowadays, learning is no longer a luxury. It is a strategic imperative. You as an individual and your company as a whole have got to keep learning and adapting if you want to stay in the race.
But let's be clear. People learn all the time from many different sources and in many different ways. In this video, we will focus on learning in a business setting, how employees learn to perform their jobs differently and better, and how that learning can be made more effective and efficient. Employees learn from planned as well as unplanned learning experiences. The greatest part of their learning takes place informally and incidentally in the course of doing their jobs. They also learn from their peers, managers, trainers, and coworkers, from observing, from listening, from personal experience, and so on. Of course, not all informal and social learning is positive. Employees can pick up bad habits, unsafe workplace practices, and poor attitudes as easily as they can pick up good ones. Formal training and other company-directed learning experiences are a relatively small part of the overall learning that occurs at work, but they are absolutely essential to great performance.
But is that true? Do we really still need formal company-directed training in this day of nearly universal internet access, Google, Wikipedia, and the like? Yes, we do. We cannot assume that employees will know what they need to know and then go seek it out. Companies need to provide planned and structured learning experiences to ensure that all employees are consistently trained in the company's best practices so that they'll be able to deliver high-quality products and service safely and in compliance with regulations and policies. If training is left to chance or just to individual initiative, then performance will be unacceptably variable.
The business rationale for company-sponsored training programs can be summarized this way. We start off with some level of performance. Now, that might already be quite good, or it might be suboptimal, or the employee might be brand new and unable to perform at all. Companies invest in planned training and development initiatives, e-learning, live workshops, on-the-job training, and so forth, with the goal of taking the individual worker and the organization as a whole to a new and higher level of performance. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the real objective of corporate learning programs is improved performance. It's not just a gain in knowledge. It's not that the learner liked the learning or had a good time. It's ultimately determined, the value is determined by the degree to which that learner goes back into the workplace, uses the new learning, improves performance in a way that helps to meet business objectives. That's critical because every learning initiative takes time and costs money. They are an investment by the company. For that investment to be valuable, performance has to improve enough afterwards to repay not only the cost of the training, but enough extra to produce a positive return.
Of course, not all training is created equal. If we were to plot the value that companies get in return for their investments in training and development from almost none to very great value, and then look at the number of companies in each category, we'd find they fall on a bell-shaped curve. In other words, most companies get average value. Some get very little, some get very great. The point is that if your competitor is here, just average, not especially good or bad, and you can figure out how to get your organization here to where you get more value from training than they do, then you just created a competitive advantage for your company because you get more value from the same investment, or conversely, you could get the same benefit they do for a smaller investment of time and money. In business, either one of those is a competitive advantage.
18 years ago, we got interested in the question, why are some learning initiatives and some organizations so much more effective at improving performance than others? We were hoping to find the magic bullet, the one thing that the most effective programs and organizations did versus those that were less effective in what they did not do. I'm sorry to report that we didn't find one, that there is no one single magic bullet that will get us to improve performance and business results from training. What we found instead were a series of best practices, 6 of them to be exact, that the most effective programs and organizations execute consistently and well, which is why we called them disciplines. In the rest of today's session, we will introduce you briefly to each of the 6 Ds and suggest specific things you can do to enhance the value and competitive advantage of learning in your organization.
Now, we need to insert an important caveat at this point. The right training at the right time can significantly improve performance. But training is not a cure-all. As this illustration shows, there are many causes of suboptimal performance besides a lack of knowledge or a lack of skill, such as unclear expectations, lack of feedback, inadequate tools or information, misaligned reward systems, and so forth. If those other causes are the real root cause, then training won't help. It will be a waste of time and effort. Or, as Robert Mager wrote, if a genuine lack of skill is not the problem, then you can forget training as a potential solution.
So the first of the 6 disciplines is D1, to define business outcomes. Because as Rita Smith, the Chief Learning Officer for Ingersoll Rand Corporation, pointed out, the only reason that the learning function exists in an organization is to drive business relevant outcomes. Investments in learning must be aligned with the business's goals and strategies. Indeed, when training industry asked leaders what capabilities defined great learning organizations, strategic alignment with the business was ranked first, far ahead of either content development or delivery.
Now, when we say business outcomes, we do not mean learning objectives. Business outcomes are the key performance indicators, KPIs, that the business leaders care about and which they are rewarded for achieving. Business outcomes are things like improved customer satisfaction, reduced cycle time, higher quality, lower cost. Business outcomes are not what people will learn or be able to do. That is not to say that learning objectives aren't important. You need both. You need business objectives and learning objectives to create effective training. But to create competitive advantage, you must start with the business objectives. Learning objectives exist only to help achieve business objectives that serve the organization's mission and vision.
So if the business objectives for learning are so important, how do we find out what they are? Well, very simply, you have to ask. The tool that you see on the screen is a tool that we teach in the 6Ds workshop to help structure that discussion. It is proven extremely useful in large and small businesses and organizations around the world. And it is framed with 4 very simple questions. The first question is, what business need are you trying to meet? In other words, what problem are you trying to solve? While this may seem relatively straightforward, our experience is that some managers will struggle to answer, since they've not really thought about training this way before. The second question is, when the training is successful, what will people do differently and better afterwards? It's important to focus on actions, doing, because it's only the actions, the use of the learning in the workplace, that produces results. Unless people do something different after training, nothing will change. The third question is, who or what could confirm these changes are actually happening? In other words, how will we know if the training is working? The goal is to get the business leader engaged in thinking through, how are we able to gain insight? How can we evaluate that the training is doing what we expected it to do in terms of beginning to show behavior change that will produce impact? A very easy way to think about measures is that you're looking at leading indicators to assess whether or not the behavior change is actually occurring. The fourth question, what are all the specific criteria of success? In other words, how much of a change is, and by what parameters has to occur for the manager to consider the training successful? Think of this question as, what is the SMART goal for the training? And really, this fourth quadrant is assessing the first quadrant. The results is looking at your goals. How much of that goal and by when? Once you have the answers to those first 4 questions, and let's just be clear about that, because you are never answering the questions. You are always asking the questions. You're engaging in a performance consulting dialogue with the business to get clear answers to those 4 questions. And once you have them, there's a 5th question. And you need to discuss this up front with your business leaders. And that question is, if we really want employees to change their behavior, if we really want the training to work, what else needs to be in place? There has to be some kind of reinforcement or transfer mechanism for driving the use of what was learned back in the workplace. Rewards or recognition for doing it right. And negative consequences if they don't use what was taught. All of those are really the province of management. They are a part of the learning system that we do not control. And therefore, we need to get management's buy-in and influence to ensure that those elements of the transfer climate that we don't control are optimized to ensure that the training is successful.
All of the 6 disciplines contribute to competitive advantage, but D1 is the most important. If you don't truly understand the business objectives of the training, then it doesn't matter how creative the design is, how excellent the facilitators are. The training will not deliver the value the business wants and expects. If you don't know where you're going, you can't plan the journey to get there. So, what's the practical application, D1? First, be sure that training is the right solution. Otherwise, it'll be a waste of time and resources. Second, align learning initiatives with business goals. And third, discuss the criteria for success with the business leaders before you design the program.
The second discipline practiced by the most effective learning organizations is to design the complete experience, with the emphasis on complete. Almost every organization does a good job of designing the training event, but most training organizations do not do enough to plan what happens before and what happens after, which, as we will show, are as important as the training itself. The key concepts of D2 are that we need to think of learning as a process rather than an event. And that means we need to bring to bear the tools and techniques of process improvement to ensure that we have thought through all of the critical elements of the learning system. Second, we need to remember that what happens before the class and what happens after the class will be as important as the instruction itself in terms of whether or not you get results.
D2 reminds us that getting results from training is a multi-step process, like every other business process. Every business process, whether that's making a sales call, manufacturing a part, or processing an order, has three components: input, some kind of operation on that input that produces an output. Getting results from learning is exactly analogous. The first step is for people to learn new skills and ways of doing things, which they must then transfer and apply on the job in order to produce the improved performance that management wants and values. The point is that everything in the process matters. We have to look at the whole learning system, not just the instruction.
The complete learning journey from the current level of performance to the new and higher level of performance has 4 discrete phases that need to be optimized to get the best possible impact. The preparation phase is what happens before the formal instruction. We then have the learn phase, which is the structured learning experience. Next, we have the transfer phase. And you'll note that it is a longer box than the rest because it is a critical period during which transfer of the learning back to the workplace is occurring. And then our fourth phase, achievement, giving employees a sense of achievement so that they will continue to give us discretionary effort and high levels of engagement. In particular, we need to pay a lot more attention to the priming that occurs before people ever get to the formal training, because it so dramatically impacts your ultimate outcomes. If participants arrive expecting that the training will be a valuable learning experience and they have support from their managers, then they will be much more likely and willing to participate, more open to new ideas, and they will almost certainly get and use much more from the experience than that learner who attends exactly the same program, but arrives already having concluded that it is going to be a complete waste of their time. For them, at least, it almost certainly will be a complete waste of their time and a waste of the company's investment.
Managing learning as a process also requires us to move the finish line. That is, redefine what it means to complete a learning program. In most organizations today, people are given credit or certificates of achievement for getting to the end of the class or the end of the virtual training or the end of the e-learning module. That sends completely the wrong message. It implies you're done. No wonder they put the notebook on the shelf and never think about it again. We need to change the learner's paradigm and our own because, in fact, the real work begins when the class ends. The real work is transferring the new knowledge and skills to the job and sticking with them long enough that they become good at them. So, what's the application of D2? First, we need to do a much better job before class of priming participants to expect a practical and relevant learning experience. We need to answer the "what's in it for me" question in the invitation or description of the course. Second, we can't let learning end at the end of instruction. Set the finish line as on-the-job application.
The third discipline is to deliver for application. To choose instructional strategies and approaches that facilitate the application of learning on the job. And the key to remember about D3 is that it is happening while your learner is in the instruction, whether it is formal, whether it's e-learning, whether it's in the class, that this is the instruction itself. And the key concepts are, first and foremost, and very simply, that learning only adds value to the extent that it actually gets applied. It's not the knowledge that's valuable. It's the application of that knowledge that creates the value. Second, practice with feedback is essential to get good at anything. Just sitting through a forced march of PowerPoint slides passively without any opportunity to engage or practice is a recipe for having your program fail. And frankly, most corporate training today has way too much content and not enough opportunity to practice.
So, what's the problem with too much content? Doesn't learning increase as you add more content? Yes, it does initially. But as you add more and more content, you eventually reach a critical point of cognitive overload, after which the amount of learning actually declines. That's what the research says, but how can that be? How can there be less learning with more content? Because beyond a certain point, learners get so overloaded they don't have time to properly process the information. They get so confused by all the extraneous details that they fail to master the basics.
Remember what Ruth Clark warned us in her book, Evidence-Based Training Methods. Content covered is not content learned. Just because someone stood up in the front of the classroom and blathered on about a topic does not mean that people learned it. For example, you would never try to teach your daughter to ride a bike or to swim by giving a PowerPoint presentation. And yet, we will try to teach adults doing exactly that, and it doesn't work. The research is clear. A review of 200 studies by Salas and colleagues concluded that the best learning occurs through practice and feedback. Therefore, from our perspective, we need to be sure that our learning interventions include enough opportunities for practice that when our learners get back into the workplace, they've developed enough confidence that they're willing to try. They're willing to give it a go. And to do that, we need to limit the sheer amount of content that we dump on learners in the classroom. What is the practical application of D3? Well, review the amount of time spent in active versus passive learning in your programs. Aim for having at least half of the time spent in active learning and it will pay real dividends.
The fourth discipline is to drive learning transfer. That is, make sure new knowledge and skills are put to work. Because as Don and Jim Kirkpatrick wrote, if the trainees do not apply what they learned, the program has been a failure, even if learning has taken place. It's not the learning, it's the application of the learning that adds value. So the key concepts of D4 then are that if the transfer fails, the training failed. Because of that, transfer must be part of the design. And in designing transfer, we need to remember that managers can make or break the success of any initiative. They need to be part of the solution.
As Roy correctly noted, value comes from application. And one of the ways that we like to explain this concept to business managers is with a very simple formula. Learning times transfer equals results. In other words, the results the business enjoys as a result of a training or development program is the product of the amount learned times the amount transferred. Now, what does this mean? Well, it doesn't matter how good your learning program is. It can be a 10 out of 10. If your transfer is a 0 for whatever reason, then ultimately the results will be a 0. The training will be a failure and a waste of time and money.
Given the criticality of transfer, hope is not a strategy. At least it's not a winning strategy if you want to create competitive advantage through learning. You cannot be like these two guys and assume that some kind of miracle will happen that will transform the learning into results. You have to design and actively manage a process that includes structure, support, and accountability for transfer.
The transfer process has to include the active engagement of the learner's manager. Because as Rob Brinkerhoff observed, when managers support learners in learning, it does work. But when they do not, it does not. Why? Because what interests my manager fascinates me. Employees look to their managers for clues about what is and what is not important. If the managers show interest in the learning and its application, so will their direct reports. If the managers are indifferent or silent on the issue, the employees will write it off as unimportant. The practical application of D4 is to include plans to support learning transfer in the program design, such as moving the finish line. And secondly, give managers guides to simple, quick things they can do before and after instruction to help enhance learning transfer and drive results.
The fifth discipline is to provide performance support. Performance support amplifies the impact of learning initiatives because, as Gottfredson and Mosher observed, there's a huge gap between mastering the content delivered in a learning event and being able to apply that content in an effective and productive way on the job. The goal of the fifth discipline is to leverage the value of learning by helping people successfully bridge the learning-doing gap.
So what is performance support? Well, it's anything that helps ensure that the learner does it right each and every time. If a job aid, checklist, or app will help your learners perform better once they're back in the workplace, then we should provide them as an integral part of the instructional design. Performance support also helps to ensure that employees have early success. As you see on the screen, that an employee who has an early win with new learning is likely to keep climbing the staircase. But the employee that has an early failure, well, you probably have received the one and only bite at the apple that they're willing to take, and now they're done. They're going to stop trying. There are lots of different ways to supply support, from a simple paper-based job aid to the electronic equivalent of a paper-based job aid to smartphone applications, algorithms. Think creatively. What would be most helpful, and then create it. And part of thinking creatively is actually asking people who do the job, what do they think would be most useful? In our view, every program should have some kind of performance support. It should be an integral part of the learning design and experience.
And don't forget that managers also need performance support if they're to fulfill their vital role in ensuring learning transfer. We can't assume that just because someone has been promoted to manager, he or she knows how to give effective feedback that will maximize the value of the learning investment. Companies that provide their manager with short, specific guides on how to enhance transfer get greater value from their learning investments. So the practical application of the D5 principle then is to add or enhance the support you provide following your most important programs, including providing managers with short, practical guides so that they become part of the performance support system.
The final and very critical discipline is D6, document results. Now, by document results, we mean measure, evaluate, and report the outcomes. As Dulworth and Bordenara wrote in their book, Corporate Learning, you, your leaders, your investors are interested in learning only to the extent that it actually improves performance and gets business results. Otherwise, I'm not sure they care very much. Managers have two questions about every learning initiative. Frankly, every initiative, period. Whether it's a learning program, a marketing program, or a manufacturing initiative. The first is, so what? Did the initiative make a difference? And what is your evidence? And perhaps even more importantly, now what? Should we do more of this, less of it, or something completely different? When we say measure, evaluate, and report the results, we mean achieving on-the-job results, not end-of-training reactions. Frankly, as a business leader, I don't honestly care whether or not people liked the program unless that like translates to impact. I'm not even concerned about how much they learned, unless you also have evidence that it's making a difference on the job, achieving the business objectives for which it was created in the first place.
Unfortunately, there's no one evaluation approach that can be applied to all training programs. There's simply too many different kinds of trainings with too many different expected outcomes. But there are 4 universal criteria that every evaluation must meet: relevant, credible, compelling, and efficient. First and foremost, what you measure must be relevant. What do we mean by relevant? We mean that what you measure and report in D6 is directly related to what you defined as the criteria for success in D1. Think of D1 and D6 as bookends. They need to match, and they hold the whole program together. Second, an effective evaluation has to be credible. That is, believed and trusted by the target audience. Your methodology must be sound and free of bias.
Third, the evaluation must be compelling. That is, it must persuade management to follow a particular course of action. It must also persuade you to engage in continuous improvement. The only reason to measure anything is to inform future action. In the case of learning initiatives, there are really only 4 potential courses of action. I can take what I've learned and expand the program. I can continue it as it is, revise it, or I can just kill it or scale it back. An effective evaluation provides the data that we and management need to make an informed decision about which of those is in the best interest of the company and its employees. The last criteria is that the process must be efficient. Don't spend more time and money evaluating a program than the decision is actually worth. That means collect only as much data as you need to fulfill the first 3 criteria, and only data that you're actually going to spend the time to analyze and then report on. Automate the process to the extent that you can with online surveys, measurement software, and so forth. The practical application of D6 is to make evaluation part of every program design. And to be sure, you discuss the criteria for success with the business sponsor before the program is created. Remember that 4th question that we showed you in D1 in the planning wheel was for us to ask the business sponsor, what is your criteria of success? Effective evaluation is always built in from the start. Don't try to just tack it on at the end, because it will likely be very ineffective.
So, what's the evidence that the 6 Ds actually work? Here's one example from more than 50 cases we've included in the 6 Ds book and the field guide. By applying the 6 Ds to their new advisor program, Securian Financial was able to reduce the time to client readiness while simultaneously doubling performance, increasing retention, and cutting costs. To sum up, what we've covered in this session then is that learning creates competitive advantage when it is more effectively applied in your organization than in your competitors. The 6 Ds are a set of processes and tools that extend and complement instructional design and produce competitive advantage through learning.
Want to learn more about the 6 Ds and how you can use them to make yourself and your training programs much more valuable to your organization? Well, you have several choices. You can read the 6 Disciplines book, which contains detailed explanations, references, and examples of how to apply the principles of the 6 disciplines. You can also get a copy of the field guide to the 6 Ds, which includes more than 50 case examples, as well as numerous tools and how-to guides. Or you can attend a 6 Ds workshop for hands-on experience applying these tools and ideas. We offer the 6 Ds workshop both in person as well as in an online format. And then finally, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us by using the contact form on our website at www.the6ds.com.